Jerrie Cobb is primarily known for her participation in the unofficial research program initiated by Dr. Lovelace at his clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Let's take a closer look at the woman who wanted to be the first female astronaut and examine what prompted her to go to the very top echelons of the American government in pursuit of her dream. Did she have a legitimate claim to join the elite corps of NASA astronauts? Or do the facts reveal a different conclusion? This is a story that isn't as straightforward as the headlines would have us believe. So is posterity remembering her correctly? The saga of the female pilots who underwent the medical evaluations at the Lovelace Clinic had begun when Brigadier General Don Flickinger and Dr. William Randolph Lovelace II had wanted to study the suitability of a woman for space travel. Flickinger was the vice chairman of the NASA Special Advisory Committee on Life Sciences, and as part of this role, he helped to put together a series of evaluations to gather data on the Mercury astronaut candidates. In light of the controversy that would come from the program he would later initiate for women, it is ironic that he said of the ideal person required to become an astronaut, "It will take a premium man for a premium job." Dr. Lovelace was the chairman of the NASA Special Advisory Committee on Life Sciences, and he had been put in charge of the evaluation phases of the official NASA astronaut selection process. Some of these evaluations would take place at the Lovelace Clinic, because it offered a secure environment where the candidates' results could be kept private from their parent military service. After their involvement with the male candidates, both Lovelace and Flickinger decided that they now wanted to obtain data on how a female subject would cope with the same evaluations. To this end, halfway through 1959, Flickinger had begun a Woman in Space Earliest program at the U.S. Air Force Air Research and Development Command. To facilitate this experiment in female suitability for space travel, they needed a suitable test subject, and just several months after the Mercury 7 astronauts had been announced to the world, Flickinger and Dr. Lovelace had met Cobb in September 1959. Plans were made to have her become the first woman to take the evaluations through the WISE program, but almost immediately the contentious nature of their program, by 1950s standards, collided with the reality of the military at that time. If Flickinger had been hoping for official recognition and funding from the Air Force for Cobb's evaluations, it was made abundantly clear that this would not be the case. When it had become public that both Ruth Nichols and Betty Skelton had undergone some similar testing, the resulting publicity had given the impression that the Air Force was carrying out a program of selection for female astronauts. Not wishing for this rumor to gain any traction, the Air Force pulled the plug on the WISE program in mid-November 1959 to end such speculation. It was also the case that the Air Force had little to no need of such testing data on women at that time, because U.S. law stated that they could not serve in front-line roles, on the land, at sea, or in the air. A letter from Flickinger dated the 7th of December, 1959, informed Cobb of this decision and that there was no longer an official route for their testing. If Flickinger and Dr. Lovelace wanted to continue, the evaluations would have to become an independent exercise that would be privately funded with no official backing from either the Air Force or NASA. The Woman in Space Earliest program now became the Woman in Space program, and Cobb was informed that the physical evaluations would begin on the 15th of February, 1960. Cobb was fully aware of the unofficial status of the evaluations and the reason she was taking them, facts that she acknowledged in her book when she wrote that they were a private medical research program. Even so, Cobb would still turn them into astronaut tests that qualified her to become an astronaut. In light of what Cobb would later claim, it is important to understand the major differences between the process that NASA went through to select its astronauts and what she and the other women actually did as research subjects in Dr. Lovelace's unofficial research evaluations. The official NASA Project Mercury candidate evaluation program had been a thorough 5-stage process. Phase 1 had been a sift of military records. Phase 2 had been engineering and aptitude tests, interviews, and medical screenings in Washington, D.C. Phase 3 at the Lovelace Clinic and Phase 4 at the Wright Air Development Center's Aerospace Medical Laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, contained physiological examinations, psychological evaluations, and stress tests. A final screening of all of the information available on the remaining candidates by a panel of experts made up Phase 5. For Dr. Lovelace's unofficial research, Cobb had gone straight to the Phase 3 evaluations. This means that she didn't have her record scrutinized against the selection criteria that had included flying experience, engineering background, and IQ level, all of which Cobb would have failed. During February 1960, she underwent the grueling and invasive evaluations at the Lovelace Clinic, and afterwards she wrote in her book that Dr. Lovelace had told her, "You've passed the Mercury astronaut test." Of this, she wrote, "I had taken my first step toward space." Both of these statements are false, because the medical evaluations were not astronaut tests, and they did not qualify her to become an astronaut. As for saying that she was on her way to space, this was nothing more than a fanciful statement. One man who was under no such illusions was Dr. Lawrence Lamb, a flight surgeon at Brooks Air Force Base who served in an advisory role to NASA and helped formulate the medical evaluations for the official NASA program. He stated bluntly that the evaluations for the women were nothing more than a publicity stunt. When he was asked to take part in the research, he had asked for clarification on which space mission the women were expected to take part in. He said, "I never heard any more about it. There was no such mission planned." Whatever the reason for Cobb's own personal metamorphosis from research subject to astronaut candidate, she now believed that she was eligible to become an astronaut. Of course, Dr. Lovelace's comments at an international symposium in Stockholm, Sweden in the August of 1960 would have done little to dampen her belief in her possibility of going into space. Dr. Lovelace had declared, "We are convinced that also women in due time will take part in space travels." He also revealed that she had undergone some of the testing that the men had taken during the selection process for Project Mercury, although he did make clear the independent nature of the testing. If Dr. Lovelace was doing nothing to keep Cobb's feet planted on the ground, he may not have been alone. Sarah Ratley, one of the women who also did the evaluations, later revealed that the staff at the Lovelace Foundation was extremely supportive and they were saying, "Yeah, we think there is a woman going into space. And I thought when I was there that yes, we would go." On the flip side of this, Chris Stover, daughter of Mercury astronaut Scott Carpenter, and author of For Spacious Skies, pointed out that any thoughts of going into space were based on a misguided wisp of a hope not extended by NASA. She added that some of the women who took part in the unofficial evaluations began to think the young space agency was a dream machine, capable of transforming flying credentials and test scores into a spot at the top of an atlas. Once Dr. Lovelace had spoken about Cobb's involvement with medical evaluations linked to the Mercury astronauts, she experienced her first exposure to the press hysteria that surrounded human space travel at that time. Even before this, she had enjoyed quite a bit of public recognition from her record-breaking flights, but now she was getting newspaper headlines declaring her as the first lady astronaut and the first spacewoman, headlines that no doubt didn't go unmissed in Moscow, and a Soviet leader who demanded space spectaculars and firsts to embarrass his Cold War enemies with. Cobb, who was now free to speak about her time at the Lovelace Clinic, told reporters, "The fact that I passed the tests means there will be a woman in space program. They are selecting the women now." This was a huge departure from the truth, and something she had acknowledged earlier to another reporter when she had confided, "I haven't been contacted for spaceflights, but I'd be standing in line." Cobb was beginning to not only allow the mislabeling of her status in relation to the evaluations, but actually promote the false claims being made about her. She was happy being called an astronaut candidate and space lady because in her mind she imagined that she was on a course for space. As a result of this, she never corrected any of the misleading headlines about herself. Following on from her time at the Lovelace Clinic, Cobb somehow managed to wrangle her way into the NASA Lewis Research Center in Cleveland in April 1960, for some practice on the Multiple Axis Space Test Inertia Facility, or MASTIF. This menacing-looking training device moved in roll, pitch, and yaw to simulate an out-of-control spacecraft. Following an official homecoming welcome in Oklahoma, and some TV appearances, she was ready to carry on with the unofficial program of evaluations. Next came Phase 2, the psychological evaluations at the Oklahoma City Veterans Hospital. Cobb had personally secured this with the agreement of Dr. J. Shirley, the chief of psychiatry, who was interested in the opportunity to study a female test subject for spaceflight. The psychology and sensory isolation testing would informally be called Operation Venus, and as part of this, Cobb would be evaluated on how well she could deal with being totally alone. She was left to float suspended in a tank of water in a darkened and soundproofed room. Later on, Wally Funk and Rhea Herrell would also complete the isolation evaluation. Dr. Shirley would say of his participation in this, "I have no official connection with any organized program for women astronaut candidates. My work with Miss Cobb was on a purely informal basis." As the evaluations went on, Jackie Cochran came on board to provide funding and advice. Cochran was a record-breaking pilot who had become wealthy through her successful cosmetics empire and by marrying billionaire financier Floyd Odlum. During the Second World War, she had been a major driving force behind the creation of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP for short. She later became overall director of over 1,000 women who took on non-combat flying duties. Cochran knew Dr. Lovelace because he was her personal physician and longtime friend. It had been Cochran who had played a major role in Dr. Lovelace being one of the men to win the Collier Trophy in 1939, so they knew each other well. With Cochran providing the financial backing, it was considered time to bring more women on board so that more than just one set of results were available. Along with Dr. Lovelace, Cobb screened well over 700 female pilots for suitable test subjects. In her book, Cobb detailed the criteria they laid down for what she misleadingly called their first female space candidates. Minimum flying time, 1,500 hours. Minimum license, commercial pilots, with one or more ratings. They were to be no older than 40 and they were to be selected from members of the 99s. The candidates also had to be in good physical condition. This selection process demonstrates three very important factors in relation to Cobb. First and foremost, it highlights Cobb's hypocrisy when it came to enforcing selection criteria. She had enforced minimum requirements for the Lovelace test subjects, but when it came to NASA, she didn't want to be subject to the criteria they had put in place. The second factor is the smoke and mirrors Cobb was trying to build around the evaluations she was taking part in. She called them astronaut tests and called the women taking them First Lady astronaut trainees, neither of which was true. They were test subjects taking part in research evaluations. As well as this, the test subjects that were chosen were all experienced pilots, because Cobb wanted to imply that more was expected of them in the future. In reality, the evaluations were simply physiological examinations to gather data to satisfy Dr. Lovelace's curiosity. There were no other plans for the women once they had concluded them, and therefore any healthy woman under 40 could have taken the tests with the same results. Thirdly, Cobb stated that they looked for their test subjects amongst the members of the 99s, an international organization for female pilots. Once again, this exposes her hypocrisy because she had criticized NASA for doing exactly the same thing and only selecting its astronauts from a select pool of pilots. The women who met the criteria were sent an invitation, asking them if they'd like to join the program. Of the new test subjects, 12 women reached the required standard for the unofficial Phase 1 evaluations at the Lovelace Clinic, making the total number, including Cobb, 13. As well as Cobb, 2 of the new 12 would also do the Phase 2 evaluations at the Oklahoma City Veterans Hospital as part of Operation Venus. One woman who wasn't eligible for selection was Jackie Cochran, because she was in her 50s and therefore over the age limit. She did try out for the testing, but her friend Dr. Lovelace had to tell her that an electrocardiogram had revealed a medical issue with her heart. It is rumored that when Dr. Lovelace had informed Cochran of her medical disqualification, Sarah Gorlick had been able to hear the ensuing heated conversation through the closed office door. If this had dampened Cochran's enthusiasm for the research, she was also having doubts about its direction. Dr. Lovelace's original idea of performing private research to obtain data on women was being hijacked by Cobb, who was getting carried away with the idea that she could turn it into a pathway into the astronaut corps. To understand if she did have a legitimate claim, it is important to know what part these evaluations played in the actual selection of the Mercury astronauts. A quick overview of the official NASA selection process shows that once President Eisenhower had signed off on the use of military, high-performance aircraft test pilots, an initial sift of military service records was made to see who met these criteria. After the initial screening, 508 men were available for consideration. This number did not include any U.S. Army pilots because, as Dr. Alan Gamble, a psychologist who had been involved in the selection process, stated, No Army test pilots had the required high-performance, high-altitude jet plane experience. The requirement for military pilots also excluded any civilian pilots, so men like Neil Armstrong were ineligible to be considered. From this group of 508 pilots, 110 men met the specific selection criteria laid out in the job description that Dr. Gamble had helped to write. Of this group of 110 men, only 69 ended up being invited to Washington, D.C., and at the end of this phase, 32 volunteers were left. It is fair to say that after going from thousands of pilots down to just 32, it wouldn't have been too much of a stretch to whittle this number down even further to the required number, without the Lovelace or Wright Air Development Center evaluations. As Gamble pointed out, we figured that with 32 men like this, we could hardly go wrong. Chris Stover stated that when her father had been briefed about the Mercury program in Washington, D.C., he had been told that NASA was looking for a dozen astronaut engineers. Therefore, in reality, the Phase 1 and Phase 2 stages had produced the men for Mercury, because it was at these stages that the key requirements of piloting and engineering were thoroughly examined. The evaluations were not essential for establishing who was fit or not, or who could take the stresses of space, because as Dr. Gamble would state, they were a good, solid group, largely pre-selected and pre-experienced. Furthermore, they had, most of them, graduated from the military test pilot schools where there are high standards for entrance and even higher requirements for graduation. This was backed up by the NASA fact sheet, released to the press on the 9th of April, 1959, that stated, since all those examined are active test pilots, it was not anticipated that any would be disqualified as physically unfit. The fact sheet also stated, many of the conditions expected in orbital spaceflight are similar to those experienced by military test pilots. Therefore, the candidates had already been stress tested during their piloting careers. The evaluations were not even that relevant in many cases. After all, what has a proctosigmoidoscopy got to do with determining a person's suitability for spaceflight? Even the official Wright Air Development Center technical report on the selection process stated that some of the tests had been included which would not be used in the candidate evaluation. In the end, the top 7 candidates, as indicated by the evaluation results, were not even the 7 men chosen. And that's because NASA considered piloting and engineering skills more important than such things as how long a man could blow into a tube to measure lung capacity. Many of the evaluations were subsequently dropped by the time the 3rd astronaut group were selected, as David Scott noted in his book. Luckily, we were not subjected to the indignities endured by the original 7. When they were recruited, the survival of human beings in space was such a big unknown that their physical tests included having every bodily orifice probed and checked. So, if the evaluations couldn't add anything extra to what had already been revealed and assessed from the military records, what was their purpose? In effect, the astronaut selection program for Mercury had served 2 distinct purposes. Whilst phases 1, 2, and 5 had been the essential stages when it came to selecting the astronauts, phases 3 and 4 had been an opportunity for the scientific community to conduct a separate science research program, using the astronaut candidates as guinea pigs. As Charles Donlan, part of the Space Task Group responsible for choosing the first male astronaut stated, those fellows were sent out to Wright-Patterson and Lovelace for all various kinds of checks. In a sense, the astronaut program was a research program for those people too, because they had top-notch people and they could give them all these kind of tests. Therefore, the phases that Cobb claimed made her qualified to be an astronaut were in fact the least important in the selection process. As Donlan stated, those tests, per se, had little to do with their actual selection, because the only questions I ever asked finally was, are there any physical or mental reasons any of these candidates should be dismissed? If the answer to that was no, they were on a list. As for Cobb's claims that they were astronaut tests, they were not. One of the things the men had to do was squat naked over a camera. As Neil Thompson describes in his book about Alan Shepard, this must have resulted in what was surely the most humiliating photograph of his career. In no way could this particular exercise ever be considered an astronaut test. John Glenn would say of the claims they were astronaut tests, I think sometimes in the papers and magazines, the write-ups on this have been a little misleading, at least I felt they were. I think the tests mainly are run to see if there's anything wrong with a person physically. It isn't that it qualifies anybody for anything. They weren't even that accurate in finding out who would make the best astronauts, because they had failed miserably in the case of 2 men. As the evaluations had progressed, Pete Conrad had grown increasingly rebellious to their seemingly crude and irrelevant nature, and ultimately he would not be selected. His file would state that he was unsuitable for long-duration spaceflights, which is ironic given the fact that he would go on to set 2 long-duration records in space. The other candidate was James Lovell, who would not be selected due to a slight medical issue. Not only would he go on to fly 4 space missions, 2 of which went to the moon, but he would also outlive all of the other 31 candidates. Finally, Cobb and several of the other women would make the claim that they had not only taken the tests, but that they had passed them. The 1959 NASA press release points out that both the Lovelace and Wright Air Development Center evaluations were not a matter of passing or failing, but instead were measures of how one candidate compared with all others. All of this demonstrates that Cobb's campaign was seriously flawed. She claimed to be qualified to go into space because of her participation in the evaluations. She was not. She claimed to have taken astronaut tests. She had not. She claimed to have passed the tests. They were not a pass or fail exercise. Instead of being proud to have been one of the women to take part in the research, she twisted the truth in a dangerous attempt to strong-arm her way into the astronaut corps. Notwithstanding all of that, Cobb actively pursued every avenue she could to add weight to her claim of being qualified. In May 1961, she headed to the U.S. Naval School of Aviation Medicine in Pensacola, Florida, for what she was calling Phase 3 of the series of evaluations that Dr. Lovelace had initiated. Again, this was all unofficial and only secured by Dr. Lovelace through his contacts. It was also something that Cochran was not informed of. During the time she spent at the naval base, Cobb experienced some of the flight training that naval aviators went through. This included an evacuation simulation from a submerged craft in a pool and a ride on a vertical track to simulate the forces during an ejection seat emergency. She also had her brain waves studied whilst undergoing differing G-loads in a Douglas Skyraider. It was whilst she was at Pensacola that her claim that women were better picks than men for a spaceflight fell apart. Cobb had stated that because women were smaller and lighter, it would leave more lift capacity for other payload. She also said that women would require less consumables to stay alive. The physical training she underwent would expose the flaws in this argument. She would note in her book that nowhere did the difference between physical strength of men and women show more than in the physical fitness test. When doing the chin-ups, she admitted, "I couldn't reach the bar and had to be lifted. My biceps just didn't come up to the muscle mound needed." The doctor monitoring her fitness asked her, "These tests will have to be modified for women, right?" Cobb simply replied, "Yes, we'd better do something." As easy as it may have been to reduce the requirements for the women at the naval base in order for them to succeed, the space environment would not be so accommodating. There was a very good reason for discounting the smaller and lighter argument during the Gemini days. Unlike the spacesuits of today, the Gemini spacesuits didn't have movable joints and hard bodies. They were basically a one-piece inflated garment. As Russell Schweikart stated, "The Gemini suit. You're in a balloon, and bending balloons every time you move. I mean, it was really hard work." At 6 foot, Gene Cernan was one of the tallest astronauts, and yet on Gemini 9 he had struggled outside of the spacecraft. He had been wearing a spacesuit with an extra layer of protection from the jets of the astronaut maneuvering unit he was supposed to use. He would describe the spacesuit as having all the flexibility of a rusty suit of armor. It had taken extreme physical effort to fight the conditions he encountered and get back inside the spacecraft. Dr. Lamb would note on the issues surrounding spacewalking in relation to a female astronaut. One is the sheer physical strength problem that spacewalking astronauts such as Dick Gordon ran into. Women do have some limitations in that area. None of the women could have coped with the exertions of working in a pressurized Gemini spacesuit outside of the spacecraft, and if they couldn't operate outside of the spacecraft, any female astronaut would have been reduced to merely being a passenger, and NASA didn't have room for passengers as they sought to conquer the objectives of the Gemini program. Following her time at Pensacola, Cobb was even more convinced that she was heading to the stars, and she wrote, "If the Navy itself was willing to cooperate in astronaut testing of female candidates, then we'd reached the top of the ladder. The next step would have to be an official astronaut training program for women." Once again, it is important to note that none of this had been specific astronaut training, and she wasn't a candidate. She was a research subject in an unofficial private venture. As with all of the many other space-related references scattered throughout her book, this was her attempt at trying to instill in the public mind that she had a legitimate claim to go into space. What should have been a brief exciting excursion into the world of space science research, leading on to nothing but a few headlines in the press, had been turned by Cobb into so much more than it really was. Her time at Pensacola had done nothing to dampen this belief, and there were other influences that were also reinforcing it. She was now rubbing shoulders with NASA's top management, and no doubt in an attempt to be seen supporting women, in public at least, NASA Administrator James Webb had made Cobb a NASA consultant in the middle of 1961. He had also given her a certificate that stated on it, "Astronaut of Oklahoma." With everything that was going on, it's not a stretch to see why Cobb was becoming swept along with the idea that she was on her way to becoming an actual astronaut. Unfortunately, for Cobb at least, a large dose of reality was just around the corner to bring her firmly back down to earth. It is important to note that not all of the women who took part in the research were blinded by stardust. Kay Cagel made it clear that, "We weren't promised we would go. I had absolutely no expectations. If you're dating an extraordinarily handsome man, you don't plan your wedding." She pointed out that, "We were not military pilots, and that's what NASA determined it wanted." Jean Nora Jessen stated that, "I could see that there was no way that I could match up with those guys who had been selected and who were astronauts at that time." She joked that, "Astronauts is what we were." Irene Leviton admitted, "I was just glad to have some tests to take." For one of the women, personal matters proved to be far more important than chasing a dream. After her time at the Lovelace clinic, Jerry Sloan had found out that her husband wanted to divorce her, so she took the decision to withdraw from any further participation in the evaluations, reducing the number of women from 13 to 12. The remaining women were informed that they would be following Cobb to Pensacola in July 1961, and they started making arrangements. For the women, it may have looked like their dreams were coming true, but it was at this point that the wheels started to come off the unofficial Woman in Space program. When Cochran found out about Cobb's training in Florida, she was annoyed that she had not been kept in the loop. She was accustomed to being in charge and getting her own way, but now she was beginning to feel like she was being pushed to one side. Dr. Lovelace was made aware of her annoyance regarding this, in a letter at the end of May 1961. Her feelings of having her leadership role being undermined were intensified when she found out that Cobb had been made a consultant at NASA. Dr. Lovelace agreed to postpone the date for the women to attend the naval base from July to September so that she could play a greater role in the planning for it. This may have seemed to have placated her in the eyes of Dr. Lovelace, but Cochran had other concerns. It seemed like Cobb's dream of going into space was overshadowing the original purpose of the venture, and Cochran didn't like that. As space author Frances French noted about Cochran, she was a scrappy street fighter. And she worked out Jerrie Cobb and her motives right away. So concerned was Cochran that in August 1961, she voiced them to a contact within naval operations. In the same month, Brigadier General Flickinger retired from the United States Air Force, ending his direct association with the research. So far, the evaluations of the women had survived by using facilities run by sympathetic people with an interest in gathering the results of the research. But now, the unofficial nature of the enterprise was about to cause the whole house of cards to come crashing down. With a number of civilians penciled in to go to their base in Florida, the Navy began asking who had given them the authority to use their facilities. When Dr. Lovelace couldn't provide a note of authority, they asked NASA. Of course, this came as a complete surprise to them, because they had no idea what was going on. They had played no part in the program and were completely blindsided by the Navy's inquiry, and replied that it was nothing to do with them. As Jean Nora Jessen later said, it was not NASA, it was Dr. Lovelace's program. With no authorization forthcoming, The Navy wasn't about to let a group of civilians on site to use their military facilities, so access to the naval base was denied. Dr. Lovelace had run out of influence. In the retelling of this story, it's usually the Navy or NASA who cancelled the naval training, but it was neither. The fault lies with Dr. Lovelace, who had promised more than he had the authority to deliver. In her book, Cobb would write that he called her and said, "The Navy has cancelled the tests," adding that, "All we can do is notify the girls, and I'll have to leave that unpleasant job to you. I'm sorry to do it, but I'm on my way out of town this minute." Just like that, Dr. Lovelace abandoned the women, and when he did, their dreams were shattered. With Cochran going cold on the program, Flickinger retired and Dr. Lovelace literally leaving town, Cobb found herself left high and dry. All she could do was send the women telegrams informing them of the cancellation of their naval training, and that should have been the end of the woman in space program. For some of the women, this is exactly what it would prove to be, as Jean Nora Jessen stated. Some of the others moved on with their lives and accomplished things in aviation. For the few women who had caught the space bug, Jessen revealed, some of them were really upset. It kind of ruined their lives. Several of the women were very, very bitter. They thought they were going to be astronauts. After making newspaper headlines, being dubbed a lady astronaut, receiving fan mail from all over the world and having invested so much time and effort into the whole exercise, Cobb turned to one of the traits she had developed as a child to keep the program going by herself. When she was younger, she had come to the conclusion that persistence would eventually pay off. A kid is used to hearing her parents say no. It happens often. They don't always mean it. Sometimes they change their minds. With her belief that if she kept asking, she'd eventually get her own way, Cobb took matters into her own hands and turned Dr. Lovelace's private research experiment into a campaign to get NASA to adopt the Woman in Space program as an official goal. It was perhaps at this point that she took on the self-appointed role of spokesperson for all of the women. She wrote that, "I spent hours on the phone. I wrote letters and telegrams. I flew to Washington, NASA headquarters, the Pentagon. I saw and talked to everyone I could corner long enough to listen to me. I saw every NASA official I could get to, including Mr. Webb. I climbed the NASA hierarchy all the way to D.C. Walsh, Executive Secretary of the National Aeronautics and Space Council. I became Speaker of the Evening at dinners from Washington to Los Angeles. I built fires wherever I went." As space author Frances French stated, she became an irritant to people she needed on her side. Her letters became more pleading, more desperate, and began to contain alarming statements such as saying she'd go into space even if it meant she would not come back. One newspaper summed up the irritant Cobb had become to NASA. For 3 years Jerrie Cobb has harangued, lectured, and pleaded that women belong in space as much as men. If Cobb had wanted any chance of going into space, she was going about it the wrong way. In the press her frustration was beginning to show, and she declared, "I'm the most unconsulted consultant in any government agency." Top NASA managers, who had once shown her favor, now started closing the door to her. On the 21st of November, 1962, President Kennedy had made it absolutely clear to NASA Administrator James Webb what he wanted NASA to be doing.
I think it is the top priority. I think we ought to have that very clear. Some of these other programs can slip 6 months or 9 months and nothing particularly is going to happen. But this is important for political reasons, international political reasons, and this is, whether we like it or not, an essential race. If we get second to the moon, it's nice, but it's like being second anytime. So that if we're second by 6 months, because we didn't give it the kind of priority, then of course that'd be very serious. So I think we have to take the view this is the top priority.
President Kennedy had called the moon landing NASA's top priority. With Cobb's continued insistence of pushing for a separate woman in space program, she was going directly against the president's wishes. This, coupled with her public rebuke of NASA, with her unconsulted consultant remark, saw Webb, in December 1962, tell her that her consultancy role would not be continued. She had talked herself out of any further official NASA participation. It is often reported that she walked away from her consultancy role, but in fact she was, to all intents and purposes, fired. At this point, Fellow Lovelace test subject Jane Hart decided to join Cobb in her campaign to get a separate woman in space program recognized by NASA. As the wife of Philip Hart, the Democratic representative from Michigan, she could call on some political clout to back them up. Hart was another of the research subjects who had been struck down with the space bug. She stated, "It felt good being able to pass all of the tests and to know that I qualified to go into space." To say that she was qualified to go into space although she had no jet aircraft flying time, test piloting experience or engineering background is blatantly untrue. Jean Nora Jessen was closer to the truth when she said, "I really was not qualified to be an astronaut. I didn't believe that I was going to be an astronaut." Hart had not even taken part in the evaluations that were used to replicate the official NASA psychological and stress studies at the Oklahoma City Veterans Hospital because of family commitments. Not only that, even if she had been eligible for selection, she would have been deemed a poor choice for an astronaut because of her political actions, an extreme example of which was when she had been arrested at the Pentagon in November 1969 during an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. As the Apollo 12 astronauts were making headlines, Hart was also in the newspapers, in a story about her arrest. For the most part, NASA astronauts were, or had been, military pilots, and as such they were high-profile representatives of the US government, who were required to adhere to a policy of political neutrality. Hart's outspoken political views would have marked her out as someone who was considered highly unsuitable for selection as an astronaut. The two women began their campaign, with Cobb writing that, "We were received at Washington offices all the way up to the vice president. While Jane hammered away at the congressman, I addressed their constituents. Our strategy was to surround NASA, to force a decision one way or the other. Relentlessly we applied pressure." On the 15th of March, 1962, Cobb and Hart met with Vice President Johnson, and told him that unless America acted fast, Russia would claim another space first. Hart would say of their meeting, "The Vice President listened to us, but he referred us to James E. Webb, Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Mr. Webb was not enthusiastic about our beating the Russians to launching the first women in space." In response to Cobb's and Hart's meeting with Vice President Johnson, Liz Carpenter, his executive assistant and press secretary, drafted a letter on behalf of Johnson to Webb to inquire about the opportunities available for women to become astronauts. At the time, NASA had its hands full, battling the Soviets and their Vostok flights, and as part of this, they were in the middle of preparing the Mercury Atlas 7 mission. They were also preparing for the Gemini program, with the approval of the final design of the Gemini spacecraft just days away. It also had the huge task of putting a moon landing program together, and into the middle of all of this stepped Cobb with her campaign for a one-off spaceflight that offered nothing to the long-term success of America's primary goal and would have been seen by the world as little more than a stunt for newspaper headlines. It was all getting out of hand, and finally, Vice President Johnson ordered, "Let's stop this now." Whereas Johnson makes an easy target for accusations of discrimination, in regards to this matter, it is harder to dismiss Betty Friedan, American feminist and writer of the 1963 book The Feminine Mystique. She stated that if the United States was to launch a woman into space following the mission of Tereshkova, it would seem to be a publicity stunt. "I am not for using women as publicity stunts." It was a view shared by the first female space shuttle astronauts who rejected anything that would single them out just because of their gender. Catherine Sullivan stated, "We didn't want to become the girl astronauts, distinct and separate from the guys." When an all-female shuttle crew was suggested, fellow astronaut Catherine Thornton stated that although she was all for more women in the space program, "I don't know why it would be necessary to have them all on the same flight." Despite the political opposition, all of Cobb's and Hart's campaigning did result in them getting the opportunity to testify before a special subcommittee on the selection of astronauts. NASA officials, astronauts, and politicians would be called to appear and speak on the matter, although there would be one very telling absentee from the proceedings. Dr. Lovelace was closely associated with NASA, and so he had been put into an awkward position by Cobb's very public campaign. Using his unofficial medical research program as a springboard, she had turned the whole thing into a hot political issue. It is telling that of all the people called to testify in Washington, D.C., Dr. Lovelace, one of the men behind the whole venture, was nowhere to be seen. In July 1962, Cobb and Hart appeared before the House Committee on Science and Astronautics to lobby for women to be included in the space program via a separate national goal aimed at putting a woman into space. It would also see Cobb and Cochran go head-to-head. Cobb sat down, kicked off her shoes and tried to talk her way into the astronaut corps, but whereas she may have been able to fool a couple of uninformed newspaper reporters into thinking she was qualified enough, under the spotlight of the US government, the flaws in her campaign were exposed. Her testimony was a mixture of making claims that were untrue, dismissing the essential qualities needed to be an astronaut, and in trying to present her own insufficient qualities in such a way as to make them seem acceptable. She opened her testimony by saying, "Members of Congress, may I say first in behalf of myself and the 12 other women space candidates that we thank you for the opportunity of letting us be heard on Capitol Hill." First and foremost, they were not space candidates, but more importantly, the impression that she was giving of being the spokesperson for all of the women was misleading. She had no right to do this, because not only had some of the other women never given her permission to speak on their behalf, but also that some of them actually disagreed with some of the views she gave during her testimony. The main aim of her testimony was to present her case to go into space, and to this end she said, "I passed the Mercury astronaut tests in Albuquerque. Second, in 1960 and 1961 I passed 2 additional phases of testing as a candidate for spaceflight." Cobb had no right in saying any of that, but when it came to becoming an astronaut, she was quite willing to brazenly misrepresent what she was and what she had done. There was, of course, a huge obstacle standing in her way. She didn't possess any of the essential requirements set down by NASA. To counter this, her tactic was to simply dismiss them. When asked if being a test pilot was essential to being an astronaut, she replied, "I personally do not feel it is essential at all." When pressed on the matter, Cobb's response was to say, "We offer thousands of flying hours over millions of miles and literally dozens of years, and experience in all types of aircraft, in lieu of the few hours of jet test pilot experience required by NASA." The issue with her flying time, which was indeed many thousands of hours, was the fact that it had been accrued flying propeller-driven aircraft at speeds of only a couple of 100 miles per hour during long delivery flights, where she would have spent most of the time flying in a straight line, trying her best to avoid hazardous situations, an environment that was just about as far removed from test piloting as you could get. Even as Cobb was getting ready to give her testimony, Major Bob White was powering a rocket-powered X-15 up to 3,832 miles per hour, and an altitude of 59.6 miles, which afforded him 3 minutes of weightlessness before maneuvering for a 5G return. Cobb's attempts to equate her thousands of hours of commercial flying to the type of flying experience of men like Bob White were unrealistic. It has been likened to someone who commutes to work every day through the suburbs in a family car at 35 miles an hour, saying that this qualifies them for a place on a Formula One race team to compete in a Grand Prix at 250 miles an hour. The other issue was her lack of an engineering education. Cobb's idea of an astronaut was someone who just turned up on launch day and went into space. She stated, "The primary job is to fly a craft in space. This is the job of a pilot, not an engineer." Her assumption of the contribution the astronauts had made to the success of Project Mercury was both incorrect and insulting, but she wasn't alone. Bernice Stedman, another of the women who had undergone the Lovelace evaluations, would also question the need for engineering knowledge in a later statement. She said, "So far as testing their engineering capabilities, perhaps you can tell me what that had to do with sitting in a capsule whose previous pilots had been chimpanzees and which was completely controlled from the ground." By making this comment, Stedman was merely displaying a complete lack of understanding of the Mercury spacecraft and what it took to be an astronaut. John Glenn cleared up the matter of the chimpanzees when he said in his testimony that the missions the men were flying were far more complex than the test flights of the chimpanzees. He said, "The missions that these people are being selected for, Ham is not qualified either." On the subject of engineering, astronaut Wally Schirra would say in an interview, "To fully understand all the systems, to ferret out troubles with the systems, in being able to analyze these in flight and make the best contribution following the flight, you do need an engineering background." So important was engineering to Schirra, he would say, "I think probably the best part of my Mercury mission was naming it Sigma 7. Naming it, the sum of engineering effort." Whilst Cobb's testimony was mostly self-serving, Hart took a broader approach. She wanted to level the playing field by opening up more opportunities for women in the fields of education and work. As part of this, she wanted to encourage young women who are currently studying scientific subjects. While Cobb spoke about her personal desires associated with the making of history and the opportunity to bring glory to our nation, Hart spoke of the inequalities faced by women as a whole. Whatever their personal motives, their campaigning for women to be eligible to go into space was perfectly legitimate, just not the Lovelace women, because whatever they may have said to the contrary, they were not qualified. When it came time for Cochran's testimony, she made it clear that she was advocating for NASA to be allowed to continue with its space program with no distractions. She stated that the use of astronauts should not depend on the question of sex but on whether such inclusion will speed up, slow down, make more expensive, or complicate the schedule of exploratory spaceflights our country has undertaken. Instead of pursuing an immediate separate women's program, she wanted to let the current space program proceed towards its goal of landing a man on the moon, and then, at a more appropriate time, gather medical data on a group of women to aid in the selection of future female astronauts. Some would see her testimony as a betrayal of the Lovelace women, a betrayal born out of jealousy that she would no longer be America's most celebrated female pilot if one of them went into space. Others would say that while Cobb had been at home in Abilene, Texas, riding her horse Snowball, Cochran was serving her country during the Second World War. This had given her an appreciation for the need of a nation to pull together as one, to beat the enemy. Unlike Cobb, who was pursuing a self-centered campaign for personal glory, Cochran was putting the good of the nation first, just like she had during the war, and in doing so she was once again serving her country the best way she could, as a true patriot. The day after Cobb and Hart had testified, it was the turn of the NASA representatives to speak. Perhaps one of the most egregious aspects of Cobb's campaign for a spaceflight is the way in which she allowed John Glenn's reputation to be tarnished. From the whole transcript of the two-day hearing, his observation on American society at that time is the only part that is ever brought up. He said, "It is just a fact. The men go off and fight the wars and fly the airplanes and come back and help design and build and test them. The fact that women are not in this field is a fact of our social order." So, was Glenn standing in the way of women joining the astronaut corps? The answer is no. He wasn't saying that this is the way he personally thought things should be. He was merely pointing out that this is the way things actually were. What is often missed out is that he finished this statement by saying, "It may be undesirable." It obviously is, but we are only looking, as I said before, to people with certain qualifications. If anybody can meet them, I am all for them. By making this comment, he was merely reflecting on the way that America had imposed a certain ideal on women in the early 1960s, one that is vividly displayed in the way that the wives of the Mercury astronauts were expected to look and behave. He was also making an observation that American society at that time did not encourage women in certain professions, something that even Hart had acknowledged in her own testimony when she talked about the barriers faced by women in the fields of flying and medicine. Sally Ride, the first American woman into space, also stated that this was the case when she said, "For a long time, society put obstacles in the way of women who wanted to enter the sciences." In his testimony, Glenn had also said, "I am not anti any particular group. I am just pro-space. Anything I say is toward the purpose of getting the best qualified people of whatever sex, color, creed, or anything else they might happen to be." Therefore, to paint him as a villain for what he said is wrong. Cobb would later claim to be Glenn's friend, which was a rather tenuous claim for her to make, given the fact that she only met him a couple of times in over 50 years.
But John Glenn is a friend, and even though we differ on a few things, he's still a very nice man.
She also wrote to him when he had been assigned to a space shuttle mission, asking, "Can you find it in your heart to support me for a space flight?" Despite all of this, Cobb never once found it in her own heart to unequivocally dispel the harm done, and undeservingly, still continues to be done, to Glenn's reputation. With the second day of the hearings coming to an end, committee member Victor Anfuso, the Democratic representative from New York, summed up what he had taken from all of the testimony given by the NASA representatives. "According to your new regulations, there is absolutely no discrimination against women. If women can meet those conditions you have set out, then they will qualify. And you have set out these regulations, I gather, first of all, to achieve success in this program because you want the best. As Colonel Glenn said, whether they be women or men is immaterial, but you want the best. In the cold light of day, the weaknesses in Cobb's arguments had been exposed. Whereas Cochran and the NASA representatives had all been concerned with long-term goals, Cobb was thinking of herself in the short term. She had even pushed for the idea of being sent into space with the minimum amount of time spent on training. She wanted to fly a mission in chimp mode, not in control of the spacecraft but a mere passenger, purely so that America could claim the record of sending the first woman into space. On the subject of training for a spaceflight, Sally Ride had said, "It takes a few years to prepare for a space mission. It takes a couple of years just to get the background and knowledge that you need before you can go into detailed training for your mission." This is what Ride had said of a mission specialist role. The requirements for a shuttle pilot were even more stringent. Every twist and turn of Cobb's testimony was based on false information. She made naive assumptions of what the astronauts did, the requirements to pilot a Mercury spacecraft, and what the objectives were of the manned spaceflights. Despite the hearings being scheduled for 3 days, the committee found after only the second day that NASA was not discriminatory against women in its selection policy, and that, given the embryonic nature of spaceflight, the choice of test pilots was the right one. They also concluded that because NASA already had 3 space programs to manage, it wasn't the right time for a separate woman in space program. For some of the women, this was of little consequence, as Jean Nora Jessen stated. "I was doing other things. I really couldn't be bothered with it. I had moved on." With Hart shifting her attention to other areas of activism, Cobb was now on her own. Despite another avenue for her dream of going into space ending, her belief that if she kept asking, she'd eventually get her own way, led her to writing to President Kennedy in March 1963. In an epic display of egotism, Cobb sent a letter to the President of the United States and told him why he should send her into space. She wrote, "I have not wanted to bother you with this matter, but I can be patient no longer." In a letter full of misinformation and desperate arguments, she wrote, "It is a fact that the American people want the United States to put the first woman in space. The truth is, there was no overwhelming consensus amongst the American people for this goal. Even after the flight of Valentina Tereshkova, there was no major public backlash over the missed opportunity to beat the Soviets, and it was largely dismissed as a political propaganda stunt. When the US government said no to a woman in space program, Cobb lost all interest in pursuing a group effort. She had supported it to add legitimacy to her own campaign, because one woman taking part just looked like a private science project, but 13 women gave the appearance of it being an official program. Now that she was on her own, she concentrated on promoting herself, and wrote, "For 3 years I have been working for this, including passing the 3 phases of astronaut testing." The next sentence reveals exactly what her motives were. She wrote that a spaceflight by a woman need not even be a long orbital shot or interfere with the current space programs. On a rush basis, a suborbital shot would suffice, or a X-15 flight to a 50-mile altitude. Cobb wasn't campaigning for science, or for establishing a sustained female presence in the astronaut corps. It was just all about her becoming the first woman in space. She had said as much in her testimony. "Now we who aspire to be women astronauts ask for the opportunity to bring glory to our nation by an American woman becoming first in all the world to make a space flight." As Frances French observed, she talked about crusading for women in the space program, but from her actions, it was clearly only about her. It was all for nothing though, because there was no way that NASA was going to let Cobb pilot a $9 million rocket plane or launch a one-off suborbital flight. In any event, President Kennedy wasn't interested in a 50-mile flight that barely pierced the barrier of space. His gaze was much further away. 250,000 miles away. Cobb's letter would have done nothing to endear her to NASA. They had already battled the power wielded by the Mercury 7, who had demanded windows and explosive hatches for their spacecraft, and so the last person they wanted amongst the ranks of the astronauts was someone who was prepared to write to the President of the United States to get their own way. Frances French wrote, "Her increasingly desperate attempts to dictate that her personal ambition should be a matter of national priority make her more of a tragically misguided figure in my mind. It's actually likely that she set the selection of women astronauts back a decade by making the subject so toxic to many people who were in a position to make changes. In one of her final throws of the dice, Cobb made an attempt to garner public support for a spaceflight by having a book published in 1963. It was basically a propaganda piece for her campaign, with a wide scattering of space references in an attempt to promote her as some kind of qualified space candidate. She had hoped that her book would stir up public support for her, something she had strongly hinted at amongst its pages. The real movers of this country are its more than 180 million inhabitants, and they're going to see that an American woman has an early place in space. Unfortunately, for Cobb, out of the entire US population, only 508 people met the criteria set down by NASA, so for most of America they didn't see it as discrimination against women, they saw it for what it really was, NASA just laying down really strict entrance requirements for a highly specialized job. There is also an interesting juxtaposition between the almost saintly impression she was trying to attach to her goal and her personal life. She talked in terms of her desire to go into space being an almost religious calling. She wrote, "No matter how far I flew, I wished it could be farther. No matter how high I soared, something urged me higher." She included some of the narrow escapes she had survived and painted a picture of someone who was being protected by some higher force so that she could fulfill her destiny. For good measure, she included a photo of her kneeling at her homemade altar, as if presenting herself as a symbolic modern-day Joan of Arc, another young woman with a higher calling. This was just another clever ploy on Cobb's behalf, because she knew that religion was one of the pillars of American society at that time, in the battle against communism. The image she was trying to cultivate contrasted sharply with the fact that she had at one time been carrying on an affair with her older, married boss, who had tragically been killed in a plane crash in August 1959. The other shocking factor in the affair was the fact that the wife who she was going behind the back of was also her boss, because she had started the company up jointly with her husband. Cobb knew her affair would not go down well, so she was rewriting the story in her book to present it as an epic romance. Frances French would scathingly say of Cobb's affair, "I'm profoundly disappointed to discover she used someone else's dead husband to bolster her own likability in her memoir." Cobb's desire for a woman to go into space was ultimately successful, but not in the way that she had hoped. On the 16th of June, 1963, Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova rocketed into space and claimed the title that Cobb had so badly wanted for herself. All of the false claims that Cobb had been happy to propagate in the press about her being an astronaut had filtered over to the Soviet Union, and may have actually spurred them on into wanting to gain a propaganda first over their rivals. When the two later met, Tereshkova would ask Cobb, "We always figured you would be first. What happened?" In reality, it had always been a one-horse race, because NASA was at a different racetrack. They had no need, time, or money to participate in this particular exercise, and there is every possibility that without the publicity raised by Cobb, the Russians, just like the Americans, might not have launched a woman into space until the 1980s. With the news of Tereshkova's flight, Cobb would reveal her true motives. Despite saying that she wanted a woman to go into space, when it happened she said,
I take it, were fairly disappointed when the Russians announced that a lady was in orbit.
I was completely disappointed. It was, of course, expected. It's the same thing that we've been saying would happen for 2 years if the United States didn't start training women astronauts, but still when it happened, it was a real bitter disappointment.
Cobb's comments on her being completely and bitterly disappointed reveal that it had never been about getting women into space. Tereshkova's flight had meant that she could no longer achieve the record of being first herself. It also put an end to her main argument of pushing for America to beat the Soviets. If she wanted to continue her campaign, she needed another angle, and so she started to push the argument that if the Russians could put a woman in space, then so could the Americans. Cobb would call Tereshkova just a parachute jumper, and in one final last-ditch attempt, she went on TV to plead her case. Like nearly all of Cobb's campaign though, this was an argument based on a false premise. The Mercury and Vostok spacecraft were very different, as science journalist, author, and radio presenter Richard Hollingham pointed out. Vostok resembled a giant hollowed-out cannonball lined with padding. In comparison, Hollingham stated, The cone-shaped Mercury module was crammed with switches and dials, levers and buttons. It was a marvel of electronics and miniaturization. The differences revealed that U.S. Mercury astronauts were expected to pilot their ships. Vostok operated automatically to a predetermined sequence, leaving the cosmonaut with little to do. Tereshkova had been little more than a passenger on board an automated spacecraft. In trying to insinuate that Mercury was as unsophisticated as Vostok, Cobb was once again, through either ignorance or deception, making false claims. The end of the Mercury Atlas 9 flight had demonstrated the level of space piloting skills required by an astronaut, when Gordon Cooper had safely brought back home a spacecraft that had suffered a total loss of its automatic control and electrical systems, a task that no mere passenger could have done. Finally, even Cobb had to admit that she had no real hope of ever going into space. With her notoriety and contacts, she had the perfect opportunity to continue her campaign for women's rights, but with it no longer serving any purpose for her to do so, she chose instead to forge a new life by flying over the jungles of the Amazon to deliver essential supplies to remote indigenous tribes, with the support of her longtime companion, Ruth Lummis. In 1973, 12 U.S. Air Force flight nurses underwent testing to support the selection of female astronauts. The results of the evaluations helped lead to the permanent inclusion of women into the astronaut corps. Whereas Cobb's self-serving plan to get a woman into space at all costs, just for the record of being first, was a road to nowhere, Cochran's proposal for a series of evaluations on women at an appropriate time that would lead to a viable long-term strategy of getting women into the space program proved to be the right way forward. When NASA did select its first women astronauts, Cobb bitterly declared, "Someday they'll send a woman into space, but it will take a long time, and even then she'll only be a token. I don't recommend any woman follow a career as an astronaut." Chris Stover said of Cobb, "She may have wanted it the most, believed the most and, in the end, been the most disappointed." When the first American women did go into space, it would not be on the basis of them being a unique representative of their sex, participating in a stunt to gain propaganda, but as an equal member of a crew who had earned their right to be there. At the end of 2003, a new book by Mary Haverstick brought new attention onto Cobb's life. In her book, Haverstick made a series of astounding claims that, if they were true, would take Cobb's influence on the 1960s to a whole new level. She wrote that she had come across a lot of evidence that pointed to Cobb being a spy. She also suggested that Cobb could have been part of a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy, either acting as a getaway pilot, waiting at an airport to fly Lee Harvey Oswald out of Dallas, or as the babushka lady with a James Bond kind of camera gun. She also said that Cobb had tried to poison her on one occasion after she had brought up the subject of her selling gold online. She also claims to have felt in danger in Cobb's company at times, describing her as real tough and ruthless.
She had a real edge to her. She was a very strong woman. She was, frankly, a woman to be feared, not to be trifled with. She was a woman of consequence. And she also did not carry with her much in the way of empathy, sympathy, many of things we think of women, maternal, caring.
All of this from someone who had spent over a decade getting to know her, and genuinely called Cobb a friend. Are Haverstick's claims a betrayal of a friendship by an author wishing to sensationalize claims to make her book more exciting, or had she really stumbled across a new perspective on one of the most well-known women pilots? When John Glenn was chosen to fly aboard the space shuttle, Cobb emerged from the Amazon jungle to make one last attempt to go into space. Once again, she would be unsuccessful. She had tried to rope the other remaining Lovelace research subjects into her campaign for a shuttle flight, but they politely declined. In September 1959, Dr. Lovelace had sprinkled stardust in Jerrie Cobb's eyes, and for the next few years she had actually believed that she had a chance of going into space. It was a dream built on a false hope that was kept alive by a willingness to misrepresent the truth and finally drowned out by the roar of the rocket engines sending another woman into space. Ultimately, it had not been NASA, or the U.S. Navy, or Jackie Cochran, or anything that John Glenn may have said, that had prevented Cobb from going into space. The major obstacle she could never hope to get over had been the social order that had existed in America at that time. In reality, Cobb was fighting the wrong battle. The need for American society to remove barriers to women pursuing certain careers and being integrated into the military should have been what Cobb was campaigning for, but when it finally sank in that she wasn't going to be an astronaut, she had been unwilling to fight to change those attitudes. When Sally Ride was chosen to go into space, she spoke about those restrictions placed on women.
I think that it's maybe too bad that our society isn't further along and that this is such a big deal. But I guess if the American public thinks that it's a big deal, then it's probably good that it's getting the coverage that it's getting. I think it's time that we get away from that, and it's time that people realize that women in this country can do any job that they want to do.
In the end, despite her own personal bitter disappointment, Cobb contributed more in her many years of humanitarian work in South America than she could ever have done from one flight into space. On the 20th of July, 2021, Wally Funk crossed the Kármán line and ventured across the boundary into space by 23,126 feet aboard the Blue Origin's New Shepard 16 flight.
Oh, I love it! I love it!
Funk's ride above the atmosphere proved to be the only time any of the Lovelace women would go into space.